Jorge Luis Borges is one of the most influential figures in 20th century literature. Destined to be a writer already at the age of 9, his entire life, which spanned almost all of the 20th century, was dedicated to books. Jorge Luis Borges was a shy man who longed for oblivion and who believed that happiness existed somewhere between the pages of a book. His influence on the very way people think about reading and writing is incalculable. Fame reached him late, sometime in his 60s, when he was already blind. It travelled beyond his native Argentina and acknowledged him in almost every language on earth. Jorge Luis Borges was born in Argentina, yet his literature belonged to the world. Marking forever 20th century literature, his collection of short stories, poems and essays have become landmarks of Latin American fiction. In all, he won 46 national and international awards, starting with the Formentor Prize and including the Cervantes Prize. By the 1970s, international recognition was bestowed upon him. Though the Nobel Prize for Literature always escaped him, Borges was then being recognized around the world as one of the great writers of the 20th century. When he became blind and could no longer read the books he so loved, he found love and a life companion in Maria Kodama. All the great themes of literature were his: time, space, and the curious paradox of being human in a mysterious and incomprehensible world. Jorge Luis Borges was born on August 24, 1899. In Buenos Aires, he would later make his own. Among his ancestors were warriors and poets who contributed to Argentina's history. The paternal grandfather, Colonel Borges Lafinur, died in battle, leaving his grandson a dream of heroic destinies. From Fanny Haslam, his English grandmother, he inherited a love of the English language. But it was in his father's library that Borges discovered the mysterious and endless pleasures of the world of books.
I feel that I've never left this library, that I've always been there, reading and rereading the same authors that I read as a child. I read a book then that had been published a few years earlier, The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. I read Kipling, Stevenson. I also read The 1001 Nights, and all those books have had a great importance to me. I also read some very bad books, but as a child you can't really tell the difference.
Borges' father was a lawyer who always dreamt of being a writer. He encouraged his son in his love of literature. By the age of 9, the boy had already written several literary works, including a handbook of Greek mythology in English.
The intelligence, his work, the way he learned and lived. All this is the influence and the heritage of his father. Me? I was the hand. Only the hand.
For Buenos Aires, the city in which he was born, Borges invented his own mythology. The family house stood in the neighbourhood of Palermo, a colourful area peopled by emigrants and hoodlums, where he lived from the age of 2 until the age of 13. His sister Nora shared with Borges a strong sense of fantasy, but her visions were not violent. Their world, for her, was the quiet, protected haven of the family house. But for Borges, even the cool, dark house was not without its terrors. Childhood gave Borges fears and fantasies that would haunt him all life long, and which he brings up again and again in his writing. Alone with his books, the boy feared more than anything else the presence of another self reflected in the polished furniture and dark mirrors of the house. He feared that one day his mirror would reflect a face and it would not be his.
Today, at the tip of so many and perplexing, wandering years under the varying moon, I ask myself, what whim of fate made me so fearful of a glancing mirror? Mirrors in metal, and the masked mirror of mahogany, that in its mist of a red twilight hazes the face that is gazed on as it gazes. They prolong this hollow, unstable world in their dizzying spider's web. Sometimes, in the afternoon, they are blurred by the breath of a man who is not dead.
Mirrors reflect death or the promise of death. But another more joyful symbol appeared in Borges' childhood. His mother often took him and his sister to the zoo, and there Borges refused the games and rides to seek out the tiger. Tigers, in their terrible elegance, reflected for the child the promise of an adventurous life.
Childhood passed away, and the tigers and my passion for them grew old, but still they are in my dreams. At that submerged or chaotic level, they keep prevailing. And so, as I sleep, some dream beguiles me, and suddenly I know I am dreaming. Then I think, this is a dream, a pure diversion of my will, and now that I have unlimited power, I am going to cause a tiger. Oh, incompetence! My dreams never managed to breed forth the longed-for beast.
Borges' dream world extended from the house in Palermo to the city around it and out into the endless continuity of the Pampas. Here in the open country he discovered another aspect of Argentina's mythology. The land where his ancestors had fought. The vast sky and the gauchos whose romantic lives Borges said he envied. The quiet country estates and the rows of eucalyptus trees, the long siestas. Borges already then favoured epics. He admired the warriors, the men of action, those who performed deeds that he would never perform, deeds he imagined had once been performed by his military ancestors. Swords or daggers, he felt that these weapons were themselves protagonists in the stories he loved to read. Adventures like the Odyssey or the Arabian Nights. Stories that took place on the other side of the world, but which, thanks to the magic of books, now took place here in his own place and time. Borges' father suffered from poor eyesight, a condition his son would inherit, and the family decided to leave for Europe in order to consult a specialist in Geneva. Led by an indefatigable curiosity, Borges discovered the literature of many authors that would accompany him all his life. The German expressionists, Verlaine, Schopenhauer, and the Buddhist masters who taught him that life was an illusion. In 1914, the war broke out. Obliged to stay in Europe, the Borges became Argentines in exile. Borges attended the Collège Jean Calvin and pursued his studies in French.
It was very important for me to be raised in Switzerland and to do my baccalaureate in Geneva, and to have stayed in Europe during World War I. It allowed me on my return to rediscover my country. That is to say, if I had spent all my life in Buenos Aires, I would not really have seen it. It would have been too close to me. But there were long years of absence, of unavoidable nostalgia. One could even say of essential nostalgia. I returned to Buenos Aires around 1921 or 22. I rediscovered the city of my birth, the city of my fathers, of my forefathers, of my ancestors. It inspired my first book of poems, called, in fact, Fervor de Buenos Aires. Absence made it possible for me to see things I would not have seen had I stayed at home.
And was it along this torpid, muddy river that the prows came to found my native city? The little painted boats must have suffered the steep turf among the root clumps of the horse-brown current. A cigar store perfumed the desert like a rose. The afternoon had established its yesterdays, and men took on together an illusory past. Only one thing was missing. The street had no other side. Hard to believe Buenos Aires had any beginning. I feel it to be as eternal as air and water.
We see the constant presence of Buenos Aires throughout his work. But we also see how this presence of the city evolves for him. In his last book, perhaps sensing his approaching end, he tries to cling to the city that will no longer be his, the city that once belonged to him. The connection is made through a new generation of poets that he says will sing the broken obelisk. And the presence of the city will live on through this new voice that will take up the baton. And if there is continuity, there is immortality.
By the time the family returned from Europe, Buenos Aires had become, in Borges' mind, a city where everything was possible. Founded, like Rome, through a myth or a legend, and containing an infinity of stories, like the Baghdad of the Arabian Nights. The city he'd imagined beyond the garden railings, the city he dreamed of during the years in Switzerland, acquired now a physical reality. He began to wander through Buenos Aires with the passion of an explorer, listening to stories about compadritos in street corner taverns, or following their exploits sung to the monotonous strumming of a guitar or the wail of a bandoneon.
Nada, solo el cuchillo de muraña, solo en la tarde gris la historia trunca. No sé por qué en las tardes me acompaña ese asesino que no he visto nunca. Palermo era más bajo, era amarillo, paredón de la cárcel dominaba Raval y Barrial. Por esa brava región anduvo el sórdido cuchillo. El cuchillo, la cara se ha borrado, y aquel mercenario cuyo austero oficio era el coraje, no ha quedado más que una sombra y un fulgor de acero. Que el tiempo que los mármoles empaña salve este firme nombre, Juan Muraña.
No te apures. El tango se baila con toda la vida por delante. Obedece al compás más que a la vieja.
Uy, ¿qué hacer? No hay caso, no puedo bailar con vos.
Low houses, cobbled streets, knives, men dancing tango in badly lit alleys. Out of this grey world, Borges began to spin his own vision of reality. All life long, he remained fascinated by tales of knife fights and secret codes of honour. He saw in these violent lives modest reminiscences of the Iliad and the ancient Viking sagas. With the excuse of compiling the biography of Evaristo Carriego, a poet, friend of his parents, who had sung about the world of the compadrito, Borges wrote a book that is less about Carriego than about the poetry of Buenos Aires, its landscape, its language, its stories. At the same time, Borges discovered the poetry of the gauchos, written in the 19th century by Argentinian intellectuals.
Today, it's impossible to write a book about gauchos without finding descriptions of the pampas. However, in Martin Fierro there aren't any, but still we feel the strong presence of the landscape. This is extraordinary because, for example, if you take that other excellent book, Dr. Secundo Sombra, the author abandons the storyline to describe the landscape in detail. But the real peasant doesn't see the landscape for its beauty. That is something reserved for cultured people. In Martin Fierro there are no descriptions, because the narrator, Emilio, a gaucho, only sees the landscape for its practicalities. For example, he looks to the sky to see if it's going to rain or not for its aesthetic beauty. That's what makes Martin Fierro and Ascasubi remarkable. They don't give false impressions.
For Borges, every story was in some sense universal. What happened in the world of the gauchos echoed Caesar's murder by his son in front of the Senate in Rome.
Destiny takes pleasure in repetition, variance, symmetries. 19 centuries later, in the south of the province of Buenos Aires, a gaucho is attacked by other gauchos. As he falls, he recognizes an adopted son of his and says to him with gentle reproof and slow surprise, "Pero qué?" He is being killed, and he does not know he is dying so that a scene may be repeated.
For Borges, the core of reality lay in books. Reading books, writing in books and about books, Borges continued a dialogue begun thousands of years ago and which he believed would never end. Borges believed that what any man has experienced, every man can experience. And he was not surprised to find among his father's friends a writer who, all on his own, had rediscovered the ideas of Plato and other philosophers. Macedonio Fernandez wrote little, read little, but thought much, and conversed brilliantly. He became, for Borges, the incarnation of pure thought, a man who attempted to solve metaphysical questions about time and existence, dreams and reality, which Borges would then make his, book after book, contriving a new literature, a new way of writing and reading.
Language is an artificial system which has nothing to do with reality. Reality is a combination of perceptions, emotions, feelings, distractions, dreams and surprises. That is reality. Language, on the other hand, is a rigid system with different rules we must obey. We use nouns to call things by names we have invented. An example of this would be an apple. We call that fruit an apple, but we can only perceive its color, taste, shape, texture, weight in your hand. But we don't really know if there is something called an apple. So any language is an artificial system compared with reality.
Borges was swept away by the creative fever of Buenos Aires. In Spain, where the family had stopped after Geneva, Borges had met other poets who called themselves the ultraists and believed the metaphor to be the very essence of poetry. Embracing the movement, Borges, back in Buenos Aires, took part in a series of magazines, Proa, Prisma, Destiempo and Critica. In 1931, Borges met a young man 17 years his junior, Adolfo Bioy Casares. They eventually collaborated on a series of hilarious stories and satirical essays under the pen name of Bustos Domecq. Bioy taught me simplicity and clarity, Borges would say later.
Jorge quelquefois. Sometimes, when Jorge came home from his great friend, Bioy Casares, with whom he used to write, He had dinner with him every evening and would come home around 11:30, midnight, sometimes later, and he would ask me, "Are you tired?" "No, I'm not tired," I would reply, and I would give him his glass of cold milk, and everyone went to bed.
One of my uncles, Miguel Casares, tried to help my career as a writer. He asked me to write a semi-commercial, semi-scientific pamphlet about yogurt. I was to be paid 16 pesos per page. At that time, Borges was struggling financially, so I asked him to help me. We went to my father's house in Pardo, Las Flores, to write there. As this was such a boring project, we fantasized about one day writing short stories and novels together. Time passed until one day I asked him, "Don't you think the day has arrived for us to start writing together?" And that's how our collaboration started. It was a very good thing to do, because we learnt a lesson of humility. When you're a writer, you think you're good enough to write about anything you want, all alone. But then Borges and I experienced the same problem. Writing alone, we used to feel helpless. But when we wrote together, our difficulties were overcome together.
Borges and Bioy had been introduced by Victoria Ocampo, Grande Dame of Argentinian letters. Ocampo was a rich and intelligent society belle, a true cosmopolitan who attempted to open Argentinian culture to the world and bring the world to Argentina. She succeeded through her magazine Sur, which she founded in 1931, and in which Borges was to publish many of his masterpieces: Discussion, Universal History of Infamy, History of Eternity, and other inquisitions. Essays which in fact are short stories which in turn are essays. These texts, like those he published elsewhere, were gathered into books under the imprint of Sur. Sur allowed him a further opportunity to write about an art form which becomes for him a catalogue of reality, the cinema.
It's not surprising that in one of the first articles that he published in Sur in the 20s, he talked about the idea that cinema reveals an infinite catalogue of human behavior. It was the only way to see how other people in other parts of the world would behave. And for him, the only way to learn about things that were impossible to experiment. For example, the films from von Sternberg were his favorites. But the ones starring Marlene Dietrich, with a strong dose of eroticism, stopped interesting him. Probably because Borges shied away from using eroticism in his work. It wasn't professional criticism. It was done in the way a writer writes about things that stimulate his imagination.
On February the 24th, 1938, Borges received a call from his mother that his father was dying. The death of Jorge Borges left his son entirely in charge of the financial support of the family. A year earlier, Borges had begun working in a small municipal library, Miguel Cane. He was very unhappy among bored and bureaucratic employees with no real interest in the books that surrounded them. Only the reading of Dante during his long ride to and from work offered him some consolation during those years. He also read Chinese literature, the short stories of Chesterton, novels by Aldous Huxley and Julian Green. He favoured especially detective novels. 1938 was also the year in which Borges suffered an accident that almost cost him his life and that he recounted in his short story, The South.
He didn't wait for the lift and ran hurriedly up the stairs. Something in the darkness brushed his forehead. A bat? A bird? On the face of the woman who opened the door for him, he saw a look of horror, and the hand he passed across his forehead was now red with blood. The edge of a freshly painted window that someone had forgotten to close had caused the wound. He managed to sleep, but at dawn he was awake, and from then onwards the taste of all things was terrible. Fever wasted him, and the illustrations of the 1001 Nights served to furnish his nightmares. Friends and relatives visited him, and with an exaggerated smile assured him that he looked very well. He heard them with mild astonishment, and he was amazed that they didn't realize he was in hell.
I underwent an operation. I feared that I had lost my mental ability. So I told myself, if I write a little critique, an article, and can't do it, then it will mean the end of me. If I try to pen a poem, it won't mean anything because poetry does not depend on us, but on the Muse or the Holy Spirit. So I decided to try something different, a story. So I wrote the story Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, thinking, if I can't write this short story, it won't mean anything because I have never written any short stories. If I succeed, so much the better. If I fail, then it will quietly prepare me for the idea that I must give up literature. So I wrote this story. It is still a little hesitant. It is presented as an article, not a story. I published it at Sur, and one of my friends told me that as far as Pierre Menard went, this article offered nothing new for him, since he had read several articles about Pierre Menard. I replied, of course, I'm not saying that I invented the story. He is a rather famous literary figure.
In Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, published in Fictions, Borges, playing one of his brilliant literary games, compared a paragraph written by Cervantes to a paragraph written by the imaginary Menard. It's the same paragraph, but Menard's is vastly superior.
Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds. Written by the lay genius Cervantes, this enumeration is a mere rhetorical praise of history. Menard, on the other, writes, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, history, the mother of truth, the idea is astounding.
In Pierre Menard, Borges' astonished readers discovered that they too had the power to invent literature, to read Don Quixote not as Cervantes wrote it, but as written by Pierre Menard, a would-be contemporary of James Joyce. While Borges was imagining a literary revolution, Argentina was undergoing its own revolution. In 1946, Perón became president.
During Perón's time, you were badly persecuted.
Well, not that badly.
They arrested your mother?
Yes.
And your sister?
Yes, my sister and nephew too.
You were removed from your position as a chief librarian?
Yes, but it was quite a modest position.
Was that right?
Yes, but they still thought it was too much for me. I don't understand politics. I only understand ethics. I knew that government was dishonest, and by reporting them, I was reporting dishonesty, and that was enough for me. And also, it wasn't a good government. It was very cruel.
Because he refused to sign an oath of allegiance to the Peronist government, Borges was demoted from his post at the municipal library and named poultry inspector at the local market. True to what he called his writer's ethic, he resigned and was forced to earn his living lecturing. Ever more conscious of how reality intrudes in the reality he'd learned from books, he explored the limits of space, the constraints of time.
Denying temporal succession, denying the self, denying the astronomical universe, our apparent desperation and secret consolations. Our destiny is not frightful by being unreal. It is frightful because it is irreversible and ironclad. Time is the substance I am made of. Time is the river which sweeps me along, but I am the river. It is a tiger which destroys me, but I am the tiger. It is a fire which consumes me, but I am the fire. The world, unfortunately, is real. I, unfortunately, am Borges.
Out of this conviction, Borges developed the idea or the hope of a place or thing that would allow him to be everything. A place or thing that is all places and all things. This Borges calls the Aleph. And yet even in this Aleph, this place that is all places, Borges, the protagonist, can't be happy. Must continue to be himself. Must continue to be Borges. He dedicates the story to the novelist Estela Canto, one of the many women with whom he fell in love.
All language is a set of symbols whose use among its speakers assumes a shared past. How then can I translate into words the limitless Aleph, which my floundering mind can scarcely encompass? The Aleph's diameter was probably little more than an inch, but all space was there, actual and undiminished. Each thing, a mirror's face, let us say, was infinite things. In the Aleph I saw the earth, and in the earth the Aleph, and in the Aleph the earth. I saw my own face and my bowels. I saw your face, and I felt dizzy and wept, for my eyes had seen that secret and conjectured object, whose name is common to all men, but which no man has looked upon, the unimaginable universe.
Slowly but surely, from his desk in Buenos Aires, Borges changed the art of literature forever, recombining its genre, bringing to new life ancient themes. At the same time, though, his sight was growing worse. The doctor had forbidden him to read in dim light. One day, engrossed in a detective novel, he carried on reading in the fading light as the train entered a tunnel. When the train emerged, Borges could no longer see, except for a coloured haze.
In 1945, I realized I was going blind and could no longer write or read. Then I thought, I will feel sorry for myself, and that is sad. I must fill my life with something different. Yellow is a color that has been with me all my life. Now it is the only color I can see clearly. On the other hand, I've lost other colors. Above all, the color that all blind people lose, but which others do not understand, the color black. They just assume that blind people live in darkness. That is not true. They live in a sort of mist, blue, green, or yellow.
From that moment, he needed people to read to him. At that time, many people did this for him, but the one who was an extraordinary help and influence on his work was his mother. His mother and the National Library. His employees and pupils would read for him too. People always surrounded him.
La primera bomba sobre la Casa de Gobierno. Después, bajo las nubes, el zumbido de los dos termitios. La destrucción cae sobre la plaza. El terror la sobrevuela a pocos metros y la recorre con la fuerza de lo devastador.
In 1955, Perón's government fell. For Borges, it was the end of a nightmare. What he called the Feast of the Monster had now ended. At the prompting of Victoria Ocampo, Borges was named director of the National Library. Suddenly he found himself master of a building which he'd compared to paradise. He was also the inheritor of a strange tradition.
What I didn't know at the time was that it was a treble dynasty. Marmol, Brussac and I, 3 directors of the National Library, all blind. At the same time, there is a certain pleasant feeling about it, because there is symmetry, and any symmetry comes from an order. So we are not in chaos, but in a cosmos, in a world with order. So if the symmetry is there, it's because there is fate, destiny.
Slow in my darkness, I explore the hollow gloom with my hesitant stick. I that used to figure paradise in such a library's guise. Something that surely cannot be called mere chance must rule these things. Some other man has met this doom on other days of many books and dark. As I walk through the slow galleries, I grow to feel with a kind of holy dread that I am that other, I am the dead, and the steps I make are also his. Which of us two is writing now these lines about a plural I and a single gloom? What does it matter what word is my name, if the curse is indivisibly the same?
For 13 years, I read for my husband because he could not, because of his sight. 14 years for the same reason, reading and writing for Jorge what he dictated. These 2 tragedies, one can say, gave me a little happiness.
She was an admirable woman and kept her pride even during the time of incarceration under the dictatorship. She was very sweet and indulgent to me. After her death, I wrote a poem called Remorse, and I think I should have been, or tried harder to be, happier, as this would have made her happy. Now she is dead, and I feel guilty at never being happy enough. I should have been happier, not for me, but for her.
Left alone after his mother's death in 1975, Borges continued his quiet routine, eating out with a few friends, being read to from books he almost knew by heart, writing new books of poetry and prose, half inquisitive reader and half dreamlike writer. By now, the world had recognized Borges' genius. Beginning with the Formentor Prize, which he shared in 1961 with Samuel Beckett, universities and governments from as far as Japan showered awards on him and invited him to travel. He'd become the universal librarian.
I truly think that I'm still the same person that I was when I published my first book, Fervor de Buenos Aires, in 1923. Everything I was going to write in the future was included in that book, but it was written between the lines and only for myself. It's like a secret literature mixed with the public one. Everything is there, but only I can see it. So what I have done since then is just to rewrite that first book over and over again, extended or enriched. So what can I say? After that first book, I've written some good pages, some good poems, nothing more than that.
The other one, the one called Borges, is the one things happen to. I walk through the streets of Buenos Aires and stop for a moment, perhaps mechanically now, to look at the arch of an entrance hall and the grillwork on the gate. I know of Borges from the mail and see his name on a list of professors or in a biographical dictionary. I like hourglasses, maps, 18th century typography, the taste of coffee and the prose of Stevenson. He shares these preferences with me, but in a vain way that turns them into the attributes of an actor. It would be an exaggeration to say that ours is a hostile relationship. I live, let myself go on living, so that Borges may contrive his literature, and this literature justifies me. Years ago, I tried to free myself from him, and went from the mythologies of the suburbs to the games with time and infinity. But those games belong to Borges now, and I shall have to imagine other things. Thus, my life is a flight, and I love everything, and everything belongs to oblivion, or to him. I do not know which one of us has written this page.
José Louis Borges, nous vous faisons commandeur de la Légion d'honneur.
I think the person talking to you now is the private Borges. The other one is the public Borges, and I dislike him. He is the one who gives interviews and appears on television. I've got nothing in common with that one. He is the official Borges.
No es así. Y un coche por defensa del triángulo argentino, y en la mitad del camino se encontró un carro encajado. Compañero, hágase un lado, dijo al del carro el cochero, y este contesta ligero, avisa si es comisario, o si lo han nombrado alcalde, o se entera que soy otario. Ahora, se usaban generalmente palabras grandilocuentes.
Among his reading partners, one, Maria Kodama, an Argentine of Japanese descent, became his love and life companion. Together they explored books, went for walks, travelled. They were married in 1986.
Borges was a very special blind person. First of all, he never complained about being blind, and he would never say anything unless someone said, "Oh my God, Master, you're blind, how awful." And because he never talked about it, I never thought of him as a blind person. That's why we did so many things together, like going to the desert, flying in a balloon, sailing a ship in New Orleans, and many other things that people never understood but that made him very happy.
Borges had reached his 87th year. The world which he had discovered in books continued to interest him more than its poor reflection on earth. And even his beloved Buenos Aires became merely a sad mirror of his experience.
And now the city is like a map of all my humiliations and my failures. From this door I've watched the sunlight set, and by this column I've waited, but in vain. Here the uncertain past and varied present have given me the common lot of every human fate. Here my slow steps have woven their unfathomable maze. And here the ashen afternoon awaits the fruit promised by the day to come. Here my shadow in the dim and final shadow shall be lost at last. Terror and not love holds us together. Perhaps that's why I too love her so much.
El último responso y acción de gracia en este cementerio que podíamos decir laico, donde hay tumbas en cruces.
Borges chose to die not in Buenos Aires, but in Geneva, where he'd once been happy.
De María Kodama.
Borges always loved that country, for many reasons, but mainly because there he learned how to be tolerant. Also, he was very impressed by the way Switzerland treated the refugees from the First World War. He was a teenager at the time, but those are the kinds of acts and attitudes that stay with a sensitive teenager for the rest of his life.
Borges not only told stories, but transformed them. For him, the essential human freedom lay in using the experience of words to name that which experience has no words to name.
A man sets himself the task of portraying the world. Through the years, he peoples a space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, rooms, instruments, stars, horses, and people. Shortly before his death, he discovers that patient labyrinth of lines traces the image of his face.